The death of an African-American man, George Floyd, earlier this year reignited the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and triggered a lot of soul-searching across societies on systematic discrimination against minorities. Here in South Korea, liberal lawmakers have been attempting to pass a law that bans all types of discrimination based on gender, disability, age, language, sexual orientation, and race or country of origin. As a relatively small and homogeneous population, South Korea has been a rather conservative society where ethnic and cultural diversity has remained a foreign notion without much political drive to accommodate the needs of foreign-born residents here in the country. But there has been a growing sense of awareness in recent years as the country's foreign population recently topped 2.5 million. To discuss what barriers are existing for foreign nationals and what should be done to tackle discrimination, I'm joined today by Nikesh Mehta, Deputy Ambassador at the British Embassy here in Seoul. It's great to see you, Nick.
Very good to see you too.
And we also connect with Jasmine Lee, Chair of the Progressive Justice Party Special Committee on Migrant Human Rights, who became South Korea's first ever foreign-born Member of Parliament in 2012. It's lovely to have you join us today.
Good morning. I hope you're doing okay despite the typhoon.
Yes, I am doing well, thank you. And, well, getting into the discussion, let's start with you, Nick. Now, having lived in Korea for just over 2 years, you must have noticed that South Korea is a largely homogeneous society. And after living in the UK and Malaysia, which are some of the most ethnically diverse places in the world, what was it like for you to adapt to life in Seoul?
I think it's a really good question, Soo-young. I'm fortunate as a diplomat to have a chance to live in many different countries, and I was born and brought up in London, one of the most multicultural cities in the world. So I have to say that when I arrived in Seoul, I was struck by the lack of ethnic diversity, perhaps. But there are many things that I found great about living here, and diversity can take many forms. Seoul can be described as a diverse city if you look at it from an architectural perspective. You look at the neighborhoods and the landscape, and of course the weather, as we've seen today. But you're right, it's not as diverse a city as many in the world, but it's certainly one of the easiest places that my family and I have found to live in.
Well, Jasmine, admittedly, there aren't many women in South Korean politics, but you have an immigrant background, so really you smashed through 2 glass ceilings. And, well, even as a lawmaker here, did you face some racial discrimination?
Of course. Basically, when I became the first immigrant member of the assembly here in Korea, it basically, I think, raised a lot of opinions regarding multiculturalism, regarding immigrants. At first, they thought, immigrants or the migrants are the people that we are supposed to help, we should be helping those immigrants that's coming into the society to have better lives and all of that. But then you become a member of the assembly and you become a member of the, the top, what they say here in Korea, 1% of the population, and it kind of raised a lot of questions regarding, multiculturalism in Korea, or if we're going too fast, or if we're going to, if we're forwarding or we're pushing multiculturalism in the country too fast. And when it happened to me too, a lot of racial discriminatory remarks in the internet, in all of the news. News reports that's been written about me. It also happened when I am in the assembly, during the time that I was in the assembly, and I can still remember the very first forum that I held within the assembly, and there were a lot of anti-multiculturalism groups who came in and basically made a mess out of stuff. So yeah, it was a difficult thing, and people would practically ask me, which one comes first, you being an immigrant or you being a woman, or which one is a lot more difficult for me. But I think it's basically being an immigrant first. Being here in Korea, it's actually one of the hardest things is being an immigrant first before being a woman.
Well, for some foreign-born nationals here, it can be an easy ride, but for others, it's rather difficult. I mean, South Korea perhaps inevitably did develop a rather positive perception of white foreigners, given that the country has had a very limited number of interactions with the outside world, which were mostly traumatic. For instance, Japan's imperialism that led to brutal oppression even over the South Korean culture. But on the other hand, South Korea later received development assistance in the late 20th century from the Americans and Christian missionaries who were predominantly white. So to this day, South Korea is heavily influenced by American culture, while perhaps less aware or as accepting of other ethnic backgrounds and appearances. So Nick, as a British man of Indian descent and also as Deputy Ambassador here, have you noticed this lack of racial awareness and even discrimination against yourself?
I think it's a great question because there are so many angles to this. Many commentators talk about the hierarchy of foreigners, and at the top of the tree are your white foreigners, and perhaps lower down are your darker skinned foreigners. And I think there is some truth to that. I think the perceptions of different racial groups as a result of exposure to media and to popular culture has developed thinking within Korean society about those particular groups, has reinforced stereotypes perhaps and reinforced these perceptions. And for me personally, I think I definitely sympathise with Miss Lee's comments. There have been times during my 2 years in Korea where I have felt, I don't know if it's discrimination perhaps, but definitely some some slight unfairness or some slight behaviour that I'm not particularly happy with. During my time here, and I'll just give you two small examples. There have been a number of times when taxi drivers have refused to stop for me, so they will pull in, recognise who I am or perhaps the colour of my skin, and then drive off straight afterwards. I actually had one taxi driver a couple of weeks ago ask me as I got into the car whether I had coronavirus. The other example is being followed in shops and malls, and I think maybe that applies to a lot of foreigners, but it was definitely surprising to experience that during my time here. And I guess the last thing I would say is that I'm definitely getting more used to the fact that I can go several days without seeing somebody who looks like me. And when you come from the streets of London, where we are very multicultural, that has taken some getting used to. I think quite a lot of this stems from a lack of exposure to people of different backgrounds, rather than overt discrimination or racism. But it does have an impact, and it has an impact for many people of different backgrounds.
And really speaking of the lack of exposure, Jasmine, a group of high school students in Korea, they recently painted their faces black for this school skit that they were doing. And this stirred controversy with a TV star here from Ghana saying that many people in Korea don't yet understand the history behind the blackface and why it is offensive. Would you agree with Nick that there's a lack of racial awareness here in the country?
Indeed. As what Nick has just mentioned, it's the lack of, exposure to racially diverse people that has become the problem here in Korea. When I first came here, people would, kids, or especially, maybe elementary school children would basically look at me and ask me if I'm a foreigner. And I would say, yes, so you're an American. No, I am from another country, but I'm not American. But you're a foreigner. I am, but still, so that means you're an American. So that is basically one of the reasons, I think, less exposure. The only people that they know of are either Caucasians, people from the Western countries, which is limited to basically white people, Caucasians. So I think people would often, as what Nick has mentioned earlier, what I would just like to add to that is that the fact that people would actually think that, sometimes kindness, or this is like Korean culture, or people would actually think that what they do or what they say is actually not discriminatory in any way, because they're not actually well educated on what discrimination is. And people would actually just think that this is something that, this is something natural, or this is just a joke, or probably this is, well, this is kindness on my side, and this is Korean culture. They would actually use that as an excuse to basically say, I'm not discriminating against you or anybody else, but this is actually Korean culture. So it's actually the education regarding discrimination in Korea is one of the biggest, I think I would say, biggest problems there, is because when you look at the Ministry of Gender and Equality's report last year, they have this acceptance survey, multiculturalism and diversity acceptance survey that they do every 3 years, which started in 2012. And it basically says that the younger generation, who is more exposed and has received more multicultural education, are more accepting of diversity and multiculturalism than the adults who have not gone through the same path, or have not experienced, or have not had classmates in school who are multicultural.
Well, actually, Jasmine, you're with the Justice Party now, and you've been trying to pass the anti-discrimination law, which has been introduced to Parliament several times but failed to really go through. Could you briefly explain what the anti-discrimination bill is and why we need this in Korea?
As I have said, I have, when I was a member of the Assembly, I passed this particular bill regarding a legislation regarding, having a multicultural education about multiculturalism in school for the teachers and for government employees. I was thinking of it as, a primary thing to do here in Korea for us to be, for more people to be acceptive or accepting of diversity. But I remember back then that there was a member of the Assembly who basically said that, we haven't decided, the society haven't decided yet if we're going to be a multicultural society or not. So, we cannot do this in school. It's not unnecessary to do what was mentioned. Now, that's what I was trying to say earlier, people not knowing what discrimination is, and what they're doing is actually a form of discrimination. So this will be, the anti-discrimination bill is actually a way for the society to basically feel, it's like, I have mentioned this in one of my interviews, basically like a mask that we're wearing right now here in Korea for the pandemic. It's not actually for you, but it's actually for other people, for you to think twice of what to say first, because there's a bill, there's a law regarding anti-discrimination. And it has failed. This is the 7th time that this particular bill was legislated or was passed in the Assembly. But one of the things that's the biggest problem that we are facing right now, or before, it was basically about sexual orientation, people not wanting to have sexual orientation within the anti-discrimination bill. And these days, we're saying it's not only just sexual orientation, but also it might limit freedom of speech and all of that. But in all honesty, there's no such thing as hierarchy when it comes to human rights. You cannot protect one right by trying to push out another right. So that's why we have legislations to protect all of these rights. And I think the freedom of speech, if people are thinking that it's not being protected by having the anti-discrimination bill, then we have to legislate and to put in some more legislations to protect this said freedom of speech, but not actually to push out the anti-discrimination bill. But I think people, after this pandemic, after the Corona-19 pandemic, people are now basically thinking that they are also prone to discrimination in whatever form that may be. So this is actually but one thing for sure is this is not a punishment bill. This is not a punishment law. It's actually for people to be reminded of what discrimination is and to be educated what it is, and for us, for the society to have a deeper understanding on what discrimination is and what lines we should not cross.
Right, and well, Nick, 55 years ago, the UK banned racial discrimination through the Race Relations Act. And of course, the law alone didn't end discrimination, but it was a good starting point, something that Jasmine has mentioned. So how was the UK able to cultivate a society that embraces diversity? And what do you think South Korea can do to learn from Britain's example?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the issue of race in the UK is a longer history than 55 years. Many people think that it's a post Second World War issue, but it goes back even further than that. But if you look at it in a post-war scenario, the UK has been a country that has encouraged migration for many decades. You can look at the Windrush generation that came over to the UK in the 1940s from the Caribbean. You can look at the migration from parts of East Africa that came in the 60s and 70s, and my parents were part of that migration journey. And for those communities, those groups that came over to the UK before the Race Relations Act was in place, the situation was really difficult. My parents tell stories about what it was like arriving here and arriving in the UK and not feeling particularly welcomed. Not having people having little understanding about the culture and the background that they had come from, and to be honest, really struggling to assimilate into society and to feel valued. I think the Race Relations Act in the 60s and the 70s played a big role in providing that security to the minority population, but it wasn't the be all and end all. And I'm not going to sit here and say to you that racism disappeared after that, because I know growing up in the UK in the 80s and the 90s that racism was still there, and to some extent it still exists in our society. We still have a problem with the assimilation and the full integration of some communities. And it goes back to something that you said right at the beginning of this piece, Sion. The issue of the Black community in our societies. And it's an undeniable fact that in societies around the world, the Black population has been the most disadvantaged. And if we think of the three big challenges facing our society, we've talked about coronavirus and how the world is coming together to try and deal with that. Climate change is another big issue that the world is trying to tackle. And in the UK, we will have COP26, the climate change summit next year, to try and set greater ambition. But actually tackling racism is a pandemic of sorts. And the community, the global community, hasn't really found a way to deal with that effectively. In Korea, as Ms. Lee has said, the anti-discrimination bill will go a long way towards protecting minority groups within the country and providing that safety net both for those groups but also for the majority. I think she made an excellent point about discrimination isn't for the minority groups to solve. It is a majority issue. Racism is for white people to look at and try and resolve. And sexual identity is for the majority to resolve. Gender empowerment is for men to grip and resolve. It is for the majority to take on. So this is why I think the anti-discrimination bill that Ms. Lee has been proactively pursuing is so important for Korea.
Well, that's definitely a point we have to take home there. Minority issues are a majority problem that we have to deal with. And while experts normally define a multicultural society as a nation that has at least a 5% population of foreigners, and Korea is nearing that threshold. So hopefully we will see faster and greater changes to advance diversity before that point. And I'm afraid we're out of time, so we'll have to let you go now. But thank you so much for joining us today. That was Nikesh Mehta, Deputy Ambassador at the British Embassy in Seoul, and Jasmine Lee, former member of the National Assembly and member of the Justice Party here in South Korea. Thank you both so much for joining the programme.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And to our viewers, thank you as always for watching. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow here in South Korea. Have a lovely day or evening wherever you are. Goodbye.